In the first year of Donald Trump's first term, the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates described Trump as the first white president. Now, every president prior to Obama was, of course, white, but in his book, We Were 8 Years in Power, Coates wrote that Trump was, quote, the first president whose entire political existence hinges on the fact of a black president, end quote. Trump entered politics on the back of baseless and racist birther conspiracies that Barack Obama was born in Kenya, which then led people to describe him as a Kenyan-born Muslim, which is interesting to me personally because I actually am a Kenyan-born Muslim, and Obama was never at any of our meetings. But that aside, Trump governed in a way that spoke to a white supremacist ethos built on a resentment of Barack Obama and everything that he accomplished and represented. It marked the beginning of a racist backsliding that Coates explicitly compares to redemption, which is the period beginning in the late 1860s when post-Civil War Reconstruction was halted by former Confederates and their sympathizers. They reclaimed power for the forces of white supremacy through racial terror, through disenfranchisement, and through gerrymandering. Sound familiar? In fact, the title of the book, We Were 8 Years in Power, refers not to the 8 years of Obama's term, but to a phrase used by Reconstruction-era black politicians as they mourned the loss of the advances that they had so briefly gained. Since Trump has returned to office, the parallels to redemption are increasingly unmistakable. Trump's second term, thus far, has taken on an even more unrestrained tenor that makes the first one look conventional by comparison. And the politics of white backlash has gone from subtext to primary message, not just for Trump, but for the GOP writ large. The Supreme Court has demolished what was left of the Voting Rights Act, and one Republican-led southern state after another is redrawing the congressional districts to erase the political power of black people. Writing for Mother Jones, the journalist Garrison Hayes writes that his colleague Ari Berman, who covers voting rights, told him, quote, we could see the largest drop in black representation since the end of Reconstruction. It was 88 years from 1877, beginning of the redemption, to 1966. From the redemption to the end of Reconstruction to the voting of the passage of the Voting Rights Act. We're a decade into the Trump era. And as the midterm elections loom, Americans who cherish democracy are wondering how to ensure that this new redemption does not last as long as the first. Joining me now is the award-winning author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates. He's a senior staff writer at Vanity Fair. He's the author of several important books, including the aforementioned We Were 8 Years in Power. Ta-Nehisi, great to see you again. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I'm sorry for doing this from a hotel room. Sorry, guys.
It's always my pleasure to have you on wherever you're coming to us from. You saw Donald Trump and his iteration of the GOP for what it has actually turned out to be earlier than a lot of people did. What currents are you seeing now? Because I don't really want to be talking to you in 9 years about what we missed now. What should we be seeing now that we might be missing?
You know, I have to say, one of the things I've actually been encouraged by is the actual resistance to it, and what is happening on the left. I don't think I would have told you 10 years ago, or I guess it's 9 years ago when I published that book, that you would have a socialist mayor of New York City, the largest city in the world. You have another socialist mayor in the capital city of the country in Washington, D.C., as it looks like it's about to happen. And then you have another one challenging in L.A. And I think, you know, foregoing any, you know, sort of endorsements of any of those candidates, I think what is actually quite interesting is a kind of opening in the minds of a lot of people of what it's going to take to resist. It's clear that things that, you know, were once off the table are now on the table.
That's interesting. So that's an interesting framing because a lot of people think that this is a shift towards socialism with these democratic socialists being elected. You're framing it perhaps as resistance, as the tool that they have, the thing they can do.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think people are, you know, the imagination, the political imagination is actually being opened up, and that's a good thing. And by focusing on that, I'm not saying that there aren't a lot of other bad things that are happening. Sure. There are, and they're very, very important, you know. But I think sometimes we miss the resistance and the things that ultimately bear fruit 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later. So everybody knows it did not begin in 1954. Like, yes. You know, you don't get Brown versus Board in 1954. That's a very, very old movement that eventually bears fruit.
So everybody knows the Civil War and when it ended. a slightly smaller number of people understand Reconstruction, and a much smaller group of people understand redemption, right? The idea, the reclaiming of white supremacy and the active nature of that. I mean, it really disappeared black people from Congress and from representation in southern states. And it took until 1954 and then 1965 to gain back what looked like representative democracy in America.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think to your point as to why people have not really comprehended the story of redemption is it is a very, very depressing tale because what it says is for a very, very brief period, for a few years, we had one of the greatest, if not the greatest, I would say the greatest democratic experiment in this country's history. That is multiracial democracy rooted in the South, which was not just the empowerment of black political figures, but in fact, a fusion of black political figures and white political figures, infusion governments, cross-racial, transracial, and it was defeated, and the force that defeated it was white supremacy.
How do you square Donald Trump's this appeal to white supremacy with the fact that he was reelected with greater margins among voters of color the second time than he was the first time?
It's not really that hard for me to square at all. White supremacy does not act alone, as a force. I think that is the first thing. And we have to remember, and this is very uncomfortable to remember, that, for instance, when Wade Hampton was running for governor in South Carolina, who's a former Confederate general, I mean, the likes of people like Martin Delany supported him. Martin Delany was black. And so I think things that are, apparent or things that, look crazy, in hindsight do not necessarily look crazy in the moment.
Well, talking about things that look crazy in hindsight and don't look crazy in the moment, the New York primaries are tomorrow. And it is remarkable the current of U.S. support for Israel is a major current. I mean, and it's, by the way, a major current between and amongst Jewish candidates. Many of the Jewish candidates in New York 10 and New York 12 are Jewish, and they are debating these issues amongst themselves. Some of these debates take place in synagogues. What do you make of the fact that this is such a central current now within the Democratic Party?
What I make of it is that the thing that plagues our era has made it difficult to hide. And in other words, the thing that is, probably what I consider a complete menace has also been a blessing, and that is social media. And what social media has meant is it's really, really difficult to hide what has happened in Gaza, what is happening in the West Bank, and the fact that this is underwritten by American dollars, by our tax dollars, that we are participants in not just genocide, but genocide in support of apartheid. And the clarity of that, the clarity of that evidence can no longer be hidden with catchphrases like, do you believe Israel has a right to exist? Israel has the right to defend itself. These kind of, platitudes that have been used over and over again. When you see actual video of people burning alive, when you see actual pictures of children, when you hear about Gaza and the plague of rats that has, descended, because there's so many dead people buried under the rubble. These are real things that are actually happening. And I think it's becoming increasingly hard to ignore.
Okay, hard to ignore, but that doesn't mean that people's hearts haven't hardened and that people are open to changing their minds on things. I mean, since you and I last talked about this, people get into their corners now on everything, and in particular on this issue. They do.
But if you look at the polling, it's pretty clear where the base of the Democratic Party is moving, and I think that is owed to a long movement waged by Palestinian people themselves, particularly in this country, Palestinian Americans, to bring this issue to the greater consciousness of the American people. And I guess I'm feeling optimistic tonight because I want to give that movement its props. And I think it's important to do that. Even amidst the darkness. The fact that you actually have a Brad Lander, openly, defying. And openly, opening this debate in the Jewish community. I just don't think that was possible 10 years ago. And I definitely don't think it was possible 15 years ago. And so I think even in, this dark and desperate time, you really are seeing the effects of resistance movements.
I want to ask you about this animus that you described about Donald Trump to Barack Obama. A lot of that was personal. It was mean. It was personal. It was derogatory. It was racist. Is there a separation between Donald Trump and what the Republican Party is and will become? In other words, the next guy may just not have that animus. How much of this is driven by Donald Trump's actual personal animus toward Barack Obama?
A lot of it But like, I would say that the latent racism of the Republican Party, which has been there since the Southern strategy, was the kindling, and Trump just lit the flame. But it's always been there. It's always been there. You know, like I talk about this in the piece that I have in Vanity Fair. There is a tendency to see Trump as this kind of, deviance from American tradition, American policy. Likewise, there's a tendency to see Trump as this kind of, departure from what Republicans previously have been. But he's not. What he's done is taken the mask off. Trump is vulgar. That's the real difference. He's vulgar. But if you look really, really closely, I mean, you can see, it wasn't very hard, for instance, for Trump to convince the Republican base of birtherism. That was not a difficult sell, and I think we know why.
Ta-Nehisi, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us. We always appreciate it. We hope you'll come back. Ta-Nehisi Coates.